Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrew Cardozo, and I'm president of the Pearson Centre. As many of you will know, the Pearson Centre is a progressive think tank that addresses the major social and economic policies of the day. And in that context, we have a series of webinars that are addressing COVID and beyond. Today is the 14th webinar in a major series that we're hosting. The earlier webinars have addressed the economy, long-term care, the manufacturing and tourism sectors, and racism, and are all available on our YouTube channel. They will also shortly be available via podcast as well. Today we will talk about Canada, the UN, and world affairs. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for today, without whose help these sessions would not be possible. The two event sponsors today are the Ontario Building Trades and Aurora Strategy Group. And our sustaining sponsors are the Canadian Building Trades Unions and the International Association of Firefighters. As these webinars are free, I do want to ask you to consider visiting our website to make a modest contribution so we can continue hosting these informative sessions. You can go to the pearsoncentre.ca/contribute. Now back to the discussion today. We are more than delighted that our guest is the newly appointed Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations, His Excellency Bob Rae. He is, of course, a former NDP Premier of Ontario, leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. He is also a human rights lawyer who has worked for Indigenous peoples in Canada. He has examined racism in Ontario and interrogated two international tragedies, the downing of the Air India Flight 182 and the plight of the Rohingya people in Myanmar and Bangladesh. His extensive experience in domestic and international affairs make him extremely well suited for his new role at the United Nations. A moderator for today is Professor Andrew Cohen. Andrew is a member of the Pearson Centre Board of Directors and is also a Canadian journalist, widely published author, and professor of journalism at Carleton University. Quickly, with regard to the format, the discussion will last about 30 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A period with you, the audience. So please go to the chat box and send in your questions, on the question box rather. We will end at around 2:45 Eastern Time. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the Pearson YouTube channel later this afternoon, and as I mentioned, will be available via podcast soon. I will be back to moderate the Q&A session in about a half hour, and we will have a final word from Dr. Karen Mock, another member of the Pearson Board of Directors. With that, over to you, Andrew Cohen.
Thank you, Andrew Cardozo, and welcome, Ambassador Rae, who's just disappeared from me. Are you there, Ambassador Rae?
I'm there. I'm here. I'm just getting reconnected here. Give me a moment. I've been on my devices all day, so that might account for my temporary shutdown.
If you don't mind, I'm going to call you Bob because we've known each other for about 40 years.
I think it's better.
And I'll hold Your Excellency when I see you in New York. Congratulations. And I thought before we get to the heavy stuff, the questions before you and our country, we might just talk about you, what this appointment means to you sentimentally. The audience may or may not know your father, Saul Rae, was Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, 72 to 76, I think it was, Bob. So just to begin, I'd ask you to reflect on what it means for you sentimentally, and then how it happened. You're not a professional public servant. This job has gone to professionals, but it also has not gone to professionals, and how it happened.
Well, I mean, from a sentimental point of view, I mean, as you know, Andrew, I grew up, my high school years were in Geneva when my dad was ambassador to the UN in Geneva. So I at those formative years of my life, I was in an international school. Global politics were part of our daily routine, not only in the school, but at home. And when I came back to university, remained very much engaged in those issues and those things. And obviously my dad went to the UN again in the 70s. And he'd been in multilateral fora for a great deal part of his professional career. So for me, this is a wonderful kind of. I'm not saying it's my last job. I mean, I know there are some people who say I'm too old to even contemplate doing this job. I don't feel that way, but it certainly is a wonderful reprise, if you like. But it's also, I think, important to be realistic about how much the world has changed and how much Canada has changed and evolved since those days. So this is not a trip, an exercise in nostalgia. There will be moments of nostalgia because I think of my dad a lot, but it's really, I think, a chance to serve at a difficult time for the globe, and obviously a difficult time, challenging time for the UN and for Canada. So to be back in public service at this particular moment is meaningful for me. I don't mind saying that. The PM talked to me. The PM talked to me about it in I guess it was February, I think, about whether I'd be interested in doing this, or whether I was interested in going, doing something for the government, which was a conversation I did not have with him 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and I was surprised because I was not contemplating that would happen, and it was clear that it wasn't something that was on the table right then for a whole bunch of reasons. But he confirmed it in some conversations we had in June, and I agreed to step up as soon as the job became vacant, which it did in July. So I'm just delighted to be doing this. I know I've been outside public service technically, but I've been involved in public affairs for a very, very long time, and I think I know the routine, as you will probably find out in the nature of some of my answers, where I may dance a bit more than you might be used to.
Too bad.
I'm not making policy. I'm advising on policy and then executing whatever it is the government decides to do, and that's a new role for me. But it's one that I accept gladly, and I think it's a fantastic time to be in the middle of all this. I've been on the phone for the last few days on a whole bunch of issues, and it's fascinating and challenging. So I'm delighted to be doing it.
So there you were in Cox's Bazar, and the phone rang, and the Prime Minister said he'd like you to take this job. What was that, your 7th trip to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh? It really was a surprise to you, Bob? You had no inkling this was coming back in February, March?
No, I mean, I talked to the PM right after the election, and I think he'd heard from people that I indicated to a couple of his staff people that I was happy to talk. If he ever wanted to talk about what it was like to be in a minority situation, I'd be happy to talk to him about that. What was it like to do not quite as well in an election as you might have hoped for? I can certainly talk to anybody about that. And I wasn't sure whether he'd be interested, but he did invite me to come down, and I met him in Ottawa in December, and he was very engaged and very engaging with me. And then I spoke to him again after the downing of the aircraft out of Tehran, and spoke to him about my Air India experience, which he was very interested in. So I kind of felt maybe he's interested. I don't know. So it's sort of like these are not jobs you apply for. And I think he felt strongly enough about it that he was willing to talk to me very directly about it. So we had a good conversation.
So Bob, you're going to the United Nations weeks after the much discussed vote in the Security Council. We did not win, as we did not win in 2010. This was a seat which we largely considered ours for the first 5 or 6 decades of the United Nations. It no longer is. What is the impact on you as Canada's incoming ambassador to the United Nations on our failure to join the Security Council? And is there a larger lesson, or does it reflect something in our standing in the world that we were not voted onto the Security Council as a temporary member?
I'm almost inclined to be flippant. Say, what's the impact on me? I'd say very little. I don't spend my life fretting about what didn't happen, and I've been through enough defeats to know that punditry is easy, and it's very easy to sort of say you didn't do this, you didn't do that, and that was there for the asking, you didn't do it. My sense of analytically is that it's actually much tougher for us to get on the Security Council than it was in all the decades that you mentioned, for a whole variety of reasons. And there are a lot of traditional allies and supporters of Canada who didn't vote for us, and not for any of the reasons that are frequently thrown in about saying, well, it was all about the Middle East, or it was all about the 0.7%, or it was all about not having peacekeepers in the field in the numbers which we're expected to have, etc. I don't think those are any of the reasons. I think that it has a lot to do with the fact that we live in a much more complicated world where traditional alliances aren't as strong as they perhaps once were. We're technically part of this group called WEOG, and I'm entering into a whole new world of acronyms, which is something I'll get used to. But we're in Western European and others, and in the last 20 years we've been very much treated like others. We've run against other Western European countries, and it's very clear that the Europeans came together and in support, and we had a great deal of difficulty in winning support, not in perhaps places you might think, but in winning support in Europe, because they said, sorry, we have to support the Europeans, like we're lined up. That's it. That's the way it is. And that's a whole EU phenomenon that's happened in the last 20 years. Much greater sense of solidarity on their part than ever before. All kinds of reasons. But in the conversations I've had the last little while, everybody's talking about the future. We're talking about COVID. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about refugees. We're talking about migration. We're talking about a major financial challenge that faces both the UN and the global community, and that's what people are focusing on. If anybody here thinks that everybody in New York is preoccupied with the question of why didn't Canada make it, I don't have that impression. That's not on people's minds. So
it sure isn't.
No, it sure isn't. And so you kind of get used to that and figure out, well, how can we contribute? And I think there's a lot of things we can do which are constructive and going to be increasingly important. Building on the work that Marc-Andre Blanchard did, there's a lot to be done, and there's a lot that Canada can do. And frankly, we'll make the difference that depends on not only what we say, but also depends on what we do. So those two things will go together.
So we won't sit here and discuss whether we're a diminished presence in the world and whether the UN, I know you won't go there, and whether the UN reflects that. But let's talk about the future. COVID and the WHO. What do you expect will come out of the United Nations? How will it act on this? And what role can we play? Is there a leadership role we can play in this manner?
Well, first of all, I mean, when we talk about the COVID crisis, we're really talking about a bunch of things. One is obviously the health pandemic, which is still playing out, and it's not over, and it's not going away, and it's a serious challenge. Then there's a question of the vaccine, and can we get it distributed globally? What role can Canada play in that regard? Because we are living in a time of vaccine nationalism, where there are countries which are determined to be first and determined to get it first for them, as opposed to sharing it. We need global protocols on how to share a successful vaccine when and if it emerges. There will be a review of activities of the WHO, of course, and that's totally justified and understandable. I think every government's going to be looking at how it responded. I think the Canadian government's going to be looking. I think the provincial governments will look at, how did they do? Why didn't they do better? Why did we have such a pandemic in nursing homes? Go down the list. Everybody's going to be reviewing it, and the WHO will be as well, and we'll be involved in that, obviously.
Is there something Canada particularly brings to that discussion on COVID, on the pandemic, and the vaccine? Well,
I don't know whether it's particular. We have strong public health tradition in the country. We I think if you contrasted the way we responded, the extent to which public health officials were taken seriously, how effectively we responded, I'd say we did pretty well, not perfectly, and I think that's something where we need to be there. We, at one time in our lives as Canadians, we were great leaders in vaccines. We were great leaders in the development of key breakthroughs. Unfortunately, over the last 30 years, for a whole variety of reasons, we've lost a lot of our domestic capacity, which, if we wanted to get back into the vaccine business, we would need to rebuild. And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that the government is reflecting on that and thinking about how do we play a positive role. And the other element, I think, is that we do have a very strong sense of that this is a global pandemic. It requires a global solution. The Prime Minister has been very clear in his public statements about how we're not going to solve this on our own, and it's a mistake to think that any country can solve a pandemic on its own. There's no such thing as a safe place. So we have to make the world safe, and that, I think, is a very important element in how we have supported all of the institutions in Geneva, not only the WHO, but also what's known as Gavi. We've supported the creation of a strategic platform called CEPI. We've done all these things that put us in place to play a very constructive role.
You've said in accepting the job publicly that you won't make policy. You're there to implement and to reflect it. The United Nations has always been special to Canadians. Peacekeeping was something of an international vocation for us for many years. We had talked about institutional reform with the United Nations. I'm wondering, Bob, if in those two areas, whether we might be revisiting peacekeeping for the 21st century, and whether we might be taking an active role in institutional reform of the United Nations, particularly the Security Council. We're not on it, but as we know, it looks like it did in 1945. Are those two areas we can make a difference given our past?
I think on peacekeeping, we definitely were involved. I mean, Canada is the chair of the Peacebuilding Commission, so we play a role. I will be taking up that chair when I get to New York in August. We play a critical role in that regard, and that's, I think, going to be increasingly important. The peacekeeping role is complex because it's not just about sending peacekeepers. It's about figuring out what you're trying to do. How are you trying to deal with the roots of conflict? In many cases, the UN is being asked to keep a peace which doesn't exist. So you have to deal with the underlying issues which create the conditions for conflict. But the resolution of peace and conflict is at the heart of the mission of the United Nations. It's the first few lines of the Charter, reflecting on the scourge of war, the experience of World War II. So yeah, that's something we're going to be very much involved in. And yes, we will be actively engaged in a number of issues, which we already are involved in terms of the participation of women in conflict resolution, the question of child soldiers, and the work that Romeo Dallaire has been doing and continues to do. So there are lots of areas where we have stuff to do, and we are significant financial contributors and significant contributors to the logistical organization of peacekeeping. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why we haven't been sending a lot of troops to some places where the UN is involved. It may be that we're not the best country to do the kind of what it is that's being looked at in particular situations. But yes, peacekeeping is huge. Security Council reform, from my perspective, which may be parochial, it reminds me a lot about discussions about do you want to reopen the Constitution of Canada? I've been there, I've done that, spent a lot of my political life for over 20 years involved in constitutional discussions, and I'm not sure that's the reform of the UN Security Council on its own it's not going to happen until there's just a huge sea change in terms of the willingness to accept and embrace a change. The size of the General Assembly has grown from 45 to 193. You probably need a bigger Security Council. You probably need questions around which of the permanent members is going to be. generally speaking, people who have power don't give it up voluntarily. So it's a tough road to hoe. But there's lots of other things when we talk about the reform of the UN that we need to talk about. Breaking down some silos, making the Secretariat more innovative in terms of how it works, responding more effectively to conflict, responding more quickly to conflict. These are all things we can work on.
Do you hope, Canada used to, one of its strengths was the Foreign Service of which your father was a member, and its ability to be creative, its ideas. Are we going to bring, under your leadership, new ideas to the United Nations? I know it's not you alone, but you talked about reform that isn't the Security Council, but it's important on agencies and the Secretariat. Are we ready and willing to lead a discussion or to push a discussion in that area?
Yeah, I think that before I would recommend our doing that, I would certainly want to be comfortable that I knew what that I knew what I was talking about, or that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel or whatever. I think yes. I think the UN itself is an institution and a reflection of the multilateral reality of our time that requires constant engagement by Canada. And I think that there is right now, and there will continue to be, a lot of thinking going on in Ottawa, in global affairs, in the PMO, in the PCO, on what are the initiatives that would make sense. And one of the things you have to be careful about is you have to make sure that the initiatives that make sense don't just make sense to you. I think one of the gifts that Mr. Pearson had, and I think history will show this, is he had a great ability to listen, and a great ability to read a room and to say, what's going to work here. When you look back and think about the creativity that was behind Suez, you realize that a lot of work went into that. It wasn't a spontaneous eruption. It was based on a lot of collective thinking about what do we need to do that can be more effective. And I think there will be many ways in which this will come. I mean, I think out of the economic impact of COVID, the Canadian government was asked by the Secretary General to lead a discussion with the Jamaican government, heads of state, which the Prime Minister did in May, and we're building on that. That's a good idea to get the member nations of the UN together in talking about the broad impacts of COVID, parallel to a discussion around climate change. These are two huge issues which we are going to be involved in, but it will require our willingness to do as well as to say. One of the reasons we had credibility on Suez is because we were willing to step up and say, oh, by the way, you want peacekeepers? We're ready. That's what happened. And you've got to be ready to do that. And I think that's the challenge that we face in terms of the need for reform and the need for new ideas.
You may remember that Mike Pearson said twice, having almost become Secretary General, except for the Soviet veto, that it was the only job he ever really wanted. He said, in his day, at least on my next question, in his day, he didn't have any difficulty selling the United Nations to Canadians. I thought, correct me if I'm wrong, that you said one of your major roles would be selling or representing the United Nations in Canada. And I may have got this wrong, but I thought you said that one of your challenges will be being an effective spokesman, tribute in a sense of the United Nations in Canada to Canadians who may not feel as strongly about the United Nations as our country once did.
Well, Andrew, the issue is not really the UN itself as an institution, although there will always be critics of the UN as an institution. But the real issue is, are we prepared to make the same commitments to global recovery and to global change, to the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm not sure have ever appeared in as part of the sort of the thinking around a Canadian budget. But are we prepared to integrate this into our own thinking? And I happen to think that this is the moment where that issue has to be met head on. We are living in a time when many countries are going to be facing bankruptcy, where there will be huge defaults, where we're still not through the effects of the pandemic directly on health, but then we're not even there with the economic and social impacts globally, which will require a significant global response. And one of the things I think we need to ask ourselves as Canadians, are we ready to step up? Do we think that's important? It isn't going to be business as usual. There are many countries that are going to fall back 10, 15, 20 years in terms of their own internal challenges to deal with conflict, to deal with poverty, to deal with the poor governance and a number of issues that have been made their lives so difficult in the lives of all their people. And the question is, where does the scope of our sense of justice, how far does it extend? Does it extend beyond our own household? Does it extend beyond our street? Does it extend beyond our neighborhood? Does it extend beyond our province and our country? And I think that's a critical issue. And I would observe that I think it's going to take a real acts of leadership on the part of all of us who believe that it does matter, and not for sentimental reasons and not for just kind of moral reasons, but for reasons of our self-interest. It's not in our self-interest as a country to have a globe that is poorer, rougher, more brutal, more nasty, and less welcoming. That's not the kind of world we're going to do well in as a country. We're going to do well when the world is more prosperous and where people can travel readily and where people can make investments and where people can buy and sell and people can engage and help one another. These things all go together. And that, I think, is a very critical part of the challenge that someone in my position has, because it's not that you're representing the UN in Canada. I don't do that, but I certainly do, I think, speak to some of the concerns that we as Canadians need to have about the consequences of abandoning the world and what the real price of that will be in the years ahead.
So as you see your mandate when you're not in New York, part of your responsibility will be having a conversation with Canadians about some of these things. I mean, you mentioned just developmental assistance. It is as a percentage of our national wealth, it is, I think, at the lowest it has been. And we're not, forget 0.7, forget even 0.5. We're struggling, I think, at 0.25 or 2.6 now. I haven't looked at it recently. Do you think having that conversation is part of your mandate or role at the United Nations? Obviously, that's a conversation in Canada, but it is something you think a lot about.
Yeah, but it's not just development assistance. Yeah, of course, it's ODA, as we call it, official development assistance. It's humanitarian assistance, but it's also a increasingly complex world of how creative finance can be used, how significant capital investments are required, which will engage both the public and the private sectors, how we need to break down some of the silos between development assistance and financial investment and humanitarian assistance. That's a lot of what Marc-André Blanchard did in his tenure, and I intend to continue that because I think it's very, very important, and it's very important for us to be fixated on looking at, for example, climate change investment, growing back better as examples of things we need to do. And ways in which we can link these two things together so the Canadians can say, well, I mean, clearly we're not going to have climate change addressed if it's only addressed in one country. It has to be addressed globally. How do we mount the public investment and the private investment that will get us to a better place? And if that helps a number of countries emerge from COVID in a significant way and get back on the track to real recovery and financial stability, all the better. And those are all parts of the commitments that have to be made. I'm not suggesting we drop any goals or targets, but I do think we have to broaden our perspective on what are we really talking about when we talk about global engagement. And I do think we're in a good place to do that as a country.
Okay, one last question before I turn it over to Andrew Cardozo. What other big issues should we be watching? You've mentioned several here. Is there something else? Big power issues, China, Middle East, Russia.
Well, those are the big ones. But I mean, in terms of the climate in which I'm working, the political climate, it's much more challenging. But I would have to say that the migration and refugee issue is one that concerns me a great deal. I talked about it in relationship to peace building, but I think it's also extremely important in looking at the impact on women and men, and how our responses need to be. We need to up our game. We have more people who are living in places of displacement, who are effectively stateless, than we had since the end of the Second World War. We've never had this number. And so we have to look at finding solutions and working creatively on solutions. And I have some ideas about that, and I've shared them with the government, and I will continue to discuss those and see that we are very much engaged in those discussions, because they're going to become far more important in the months and years ahead than they've been even so far.
So you won't be shy about sharing your views on these things. I'm going to turn this over to Andrew Cardozo, who has questions from the audience.
Hi, hello, Ambassador Rae. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I'm not used to those words in front of my name, but I can hear you fine, Andrew.
I could call you Your Excellency too.
Well, most people just call me Bob still, thank goodness. Certainly around here, we haven't expanded to these great heights of protocol.
Well, get used to it. It's big in the UN. There are a lot of questions coming in. They're all really carrying on to the questions that you've just discussed with Andrew Cohen. They dig deeper and wider, but there's one question on domestic issues, which I'll start with. Given your experience of governing during a recession, what is your advice to the governments of today dealing with the situation we have today?
Well, I think they're on the right track. I mean, I think that what they've done is understand that you have to be bold in dealing with a crisis that has no precedence. I mean, the federal government is not unlimited in what it can do. I think it would be unusual for anybody to think that. But I do think at a time when interest rates are at an all-time low, governments can afford to do more than was perhaps able to be contemplated. And you've got to work in partnership with a lot of people and with a lot of institutions, and always keep your eye on the very real human consequences of what we're going through. These are not just numbers dancing across a page. These are real people who are facing enormously difficult circumstances. And I think it's so important for us to realize that, and to realize that, you know, we're doing what a number of other countries are doing, which is engaging in a process of trying to keep the economy as whole as possible and trying to keep people as whole as possible during this very, very difficult time.
Okay, we have a few questions that deal with specific issues, and I'll start with those. The first is, what can you do as the UN for the release, or at least the better treatment of the two Michaels in China?
Well, the honest answer would be I'm going to see. I think it's important for everyone to know that, based on the briefings that I've received and what I've been told and what I've heard, this issue is a top priority for the government. It's a top priority for the Prime Minister. I spoke about it yesterday at some length with Minister Champagne, and if there's anything we can do in New York to be helpful, we will do it. I'm not a believer in easy solutions. I think I don't think there's easy ones, but I do think we have to keep it top of mind, and it certainly is top of mind for me. And as I said, my observation is that it's very much top of mind for the government of Canada.
Okay, the next question is regarding Israel, and I will read this. It's a bit long, but I want to get it right. Canada is a strong ally to Israel and is on record as supporting a negotiated statement for a two-state solution to the conflict. How can you and Canada disagree with some of Israel's current policies and practices while remaining a strong ally and not piling up on the disproportionate singling out of Israel by negative UN resolutions?
Well, I think every UN ambassador from Canada, from any country, but certainly from Canada, knows that this is an important issue, and it's one that is full of challenges. I think it's, go back to first principles. We support two states for two peoples. We believe in the right of the Palestinians to a state of their own. We believe that Israel security is critically important, and we have developed since the early 1950s a very strong friendship and alliance with the government and the people of Israel. That has never stopped us in our relations with any country in saying we agree or disagree. We don't agree with unilateral annexation of any of the territories that were taken after 1967. We believe in a negotiated solution that will arrive at two states. We do think that the Palestinians, the question of Palestinians having a state has been effectively decided by our country and by a number of other countries, but under terms and conditions that have to be negotiated between the parties, and also where obviously other countries play a role in helping people to find a solution. We don't find successful solutions by taking unilateral approaches, whether it's whichever side thinks that that's the way to go. I don't think that's the way to go. But I'm under no illusions as to how easy this is, or again, how everyone is watching what I say and parsing every word and every comment. And so I'm very familiar with the issue. I've been going to the Middle East since the mid 1970s as a member of Parliament, as a premier, as a private citizen, in a variety of roles. I've spent time on the West Bank. I've spent time in refugee camps. I've spent time meeting with leaders of the Palestinian Authority. I've met with every Israeli leader over the last 30 years and know many members of their governments. This is not an area that's unknown to me at all. But I think that's what makes me aware that it's complicated. And I certainly don't think that it helps if Canada takes rhetorical positions. We have to take positions that reflect our long-term, long-standing positions, which are really pretty clear. And I think they will continue to be as clear as I can possibly make them.
Thank you. The next question deals with an issue you've been working on in recent years. First Nations in Canada have asked the UN for assistance in terms of expanding rights or recognizing rights. What can you do to help?
Well, I think the fact is that the issue of Indigenous rights has become an international issue. Not only in Canada but globally. The UN Declaration was the product of a lot of Indigenous diplomacy. Really, quite a remarkable story as to how this emerged out of the decolonized world, and how Canadians and Indigenous people in Canada and elsewhere spent a great deal of time. And I think that's the way it should be. And I will do everything I can to facilitate those discussions and that role. I think it's extremely important.
So do you look forward to Canada passing UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples?
Well, I'm still a private citizen until August the 4th, and so I can say, yes, absolutely, I do. Without any hesitation.
Well, we'll hold you to that in a few days when your title changes. Okay, so there are a few other international questions. So coming back to the issue of kind of touching on the issue of the UN Security Council, how do you see that the UN can be reformed when the Security Council maybe can't be reformed as much, especially in terms of expanding the role of multilateralism?
I think that's where we're going to have to be innovative. I think that the Security Council has not been able to respond to a number of crises because of the global politics underway, the countries that have a veto and so on. That's not going to change quickly. That's not going to suddenly dramatically shift. So we and other countries, whether you're on the Security Council or not, you're going to have to learn how to be more innovative in finding new instruments of ways of getting countries getting together, resolving issues. Donor and host countries on migration have to get together and talk to one another. With refugees, we have to engage with people who've been impacted by displacement. On peace building, we have to work creatively, multilaterally, as well as bilaterally. We have to accept the fact that it's a multinodal, multipolar world. It's a very different place, and so you have to be prepared to be innovative and creative in terms of the partnerships that you're creating. And they may be a partnership on one issue, may not be a partnership on another issue. You may end up having something in common with countries on the Arctic and elsewhere, and not with others. That's all normal. That's the new normal.
So we're getting a lot of questions. Do you mind if we go another 5 minutes or so?
My only problem is I think my my battery may, even though I've got it plugged in, it may not last. But if I suddenly black out, it's not because I disagree with anybody. It's because I.
Well, let me
try and speed it up.
Yeah, okay. I'll try and do a broader question here. I'll go to a more closing kind of question. What gives you hope for the future from a progressive point of view for the world?
Well, I guess it's because I believe fundamentally that what we identify as progressive values are human values that have enormous base in our ethical lives, in our personal lives, and what we feel is right, and what we know is right, and that ultimately will prevail. It's not easy. We face a world that is, more authoritarian, going in strange directions in many ways. We have to respond to that, but I do think we should show some self-confidence in what we believe in, what we think is right. And I think that's what makes me proud to get up every day, and happy to get up as the ambassador of Canada to the UN. I think we got nothing to apologize for.
And lastly, in terms of the various tables at the UN, besides the Security Council, we're involved in various other issues. Do you see us taking a leadership in any of those areas, be it refugees or other areas?
Well, I think on refugees, we are leaders. I mean, we're a huge contributor to globally. We're number 6 or 7 in terms of our financial contributions. We're a country that takes in refugees per capita more than a great many other countries. We're world leaders on the issue of migration. We have been for a considerable time, and we will continue to be. And that, I think, is where we can be quite creative in looking at ways in which we can help. Not by saying we're going to take in 2 million people tomorrow, and let's not forget there's as many as 100 million who are now currently displaced. But by saying we need to engage in candid conversations about how we intend to resolve these situations, which from a human point of view are intolerable. People are living in intolerable conditions. And so we have to figure out how to make those conditions better, how to make people's lives better, and how to respond creatively. We were very much a part, for example, of the so-called grand bargain in Jordan, in looking at ways in which we can actually improve the conditions of refugees on the ground. We were very much part of that, and we're going to continue to be part of those discussions. And I've talked with people at the UNHCR and other NGOs. People know what Canada has done. They know that we're willing to play a leadership role, and they want us to continue to do that and to participate with them in finding creative solutions.
That's very encouraging. Listen, before I leave the stage, I'll just mention to the audience we've got several webinars coming up in August, but 2 more I want to announce today. On July the 29th, actually, we've got a conversation with former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. He'll be in conversation with former New Brunswick Premier Brian Gallant. And on August the 11th, we have a discussion with Immigration Minister Marco Mendicino. So with that, I turn over to Dr. Karen Mock, who's a board member at Pearson and president of JSpace Canada. Over to you, Karen Mock.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I was just delighted to have been able to be a small part of today's webinar. to give the brief closing remarks and the vote of thanks. First, I want to thank everyone who tuned in. We really do appreciate your support, and we hope that you'll join us in the future as well. Andrew Cohen, thank you for your moderation of this webinar. You've got a wealth of knowledge. We've been on the Pearson board together since its inception, and I look forward to continuing to serve with you with pride. I really want to take this opportunity to make a very special vote of thanks to you, Andrew Cardozo, because you're the heart and soul of Pearson as its founder and as its president. I want to thank you also for seeing us through this very, very difficult time and for having the vision to act quickly during the COVID. And of course, to include Bob Rae, who we can still call Bob for a little while longer at this difficult time. Bob, what can I say? We've known each other for so long, and I've always been a big fan. We've worked together on issues of equity and anti-racism and human rights and social justice, and you have an amazing track record in these areas that from our point of view certainly stand you in amazing stead to take on this next exciting challenge of your life. I, for one, can't think of a better couple than you and Arlene, your life's partner, to represent Canada at the UN. Looks like he may still be listening, but somehow it's gone off a bit. So I really just want to take this opportunity to wish you all the very, very best. We wish that we could gather personally to send you off to New York in style, and God willing, we'll be able to celebrate that way in the near future. We wish you all the very best, and may you, and thereby Canada, continue to go from strength to strength. Thank you so much. All the best.
Great, thank you. There we go.